from their encounters with races from other planets. The information is the activation. Let's awaken this world together. We are the forever students, and we will not be silent. We are the ones that we've been waiting for. It's pretty wild. Welcome, everybody, to Full Spectrum Universe. My name is Rob Yoxby at the Embattled Broadcast from behind enemy lines in the once great state of New York. Welcome. Tonight is a sort of a special evening. This is something that I've been working on for a little while now, and I have a tremendous fascination with the likes of Atlantis, Lemuria, and the island of Mu. Now, we're going to go over a little bit of information as well as go over some tales that people have garnered that are their past life regressions or hypnosis or meditations that showed them what they had been like or what life was like in Atlantis. Some of them having seen certain cataclysms, some of them having been just, going through the motions of everyday life. I thought it was so special to be able to tap into a lot of these stories. Now, majority of these stories are going to be anonymous. I'm going to tell you why. There is an anonymity to somebody's past life and what it brings to their forefront in today's life. So the only story I'm going to tell you about are the people that I have gotten the permission essentially to speak their name. One of which is Ellie. Okay. Ellie has a tremendous descriptive story, but we're also at the end of the broadcast going to go over specifically my story and what makes me so fascinated or so, I guess, attached to Atlantis in that time period and what was really going on then and what was really happening. Also, when we went into a lot of the galactical histories or the galactical timelines, as you all know, I'm really trying to become a galactical historian off the top of my head in the sense that I can, talk about anything and everything that has to do with the galactic peoples and how we came to be. So a lot of that was starting to really give me this sense of longing to figure out what was my my past with all of this and what my contributions could be to the community in finding out my past. Now, like I said, I'm going to go into my story in detail, and I haven't really put it out there ever. So this is something that I've done a tremendous amount of meditation and contact with my guides and looking basically through my timelines of my past lives. I have been told about this again through past life regressions via mediums many years ago, but to go into detail about it, it took a tremendous amount of concentration, a tremendous amount of purposeful meditation to figure it out. So I just wanted to, before we start all of that, I would love to go into a little bit of what we have coming up. Yet again, sorry about that. I hope I'm not coming down with anything, but we got a little congestion here. So we have the winter summer solstice, 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, can be seen for free on this channel. This is one of the free events that we do every year. This is 3 years running, but this is the third and last seed dreaming type of conference. After that, we will be into the new paradigm. And as everybody knows, the seed dreaming, just to bring it back to me for a second, is based off of the Hopi prophecy of this tremendous split of high frequency people going in one direction, lower frequency people going in another direction. There is a complete story behind that. And maybe before we get to that point, I will do a whole episode on what that story truly in details and what that means. Now, when we talk about this seed dreaming, the Aboriginals also have a similar story that goes into the Hopi prophecy, right? There's a lot of connection between ancient Native Americans and the Aboriginal peoples, showing that they shared a common ancestry somewhere down the line. And if we've been following the works of Stephen and Evan Strong, we know that the Aboriginals are the first peoples. right? That's what that means. Aboriginal, the original people, right? So we have that coming up. It's going to be a completely tremendous event. Right now, there are 70 speakers over 3 days. We've done something similar with 120 speakers over 11 days. This is going to be a lot more compact, a lot more informative. Each day is going to have twice the amount of speakers because instead of an hour, it's only a half an hour apiece. So, what that means is they're going to get to the sweet spot immediately and expand from that sweet spot and giving you all of the prevalent information about what they also want to see gratitude wise and timeline wise moving into this new paradigm. So now that we've paid some of the bills again, one more time 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That is no coincidence. So let's talk about Atlantis. So before we get into some of the tales, I know a lot of people know about Atlantis, but I want to go over uh, sort of the textbook version of Atlantis. And I'm going to tell you why. This is going to give us an insight and a mention into the gods. And the gods are a part of Atlantis, right? The Greek pantheon is a part of Atlantis. Now, if we study comparative mythology like I do, we know that these gods from Egypt to Sumeria to Greece to Rome and so on and so forth can be followed as a I guess a timeline is the best way to put it. One specific entity essentially becomes known in Sumeria. From there, they move to Egypt and from and Babylon and all of that area, and they changed their names, but they yet remain the same via their actions. This is something that we saw when we talked about Enki and Lil and Thoth. This is all the same type of stuff. So I'm going to give you a picture, a snap point picture of after Atlantis was gone for many, many years. This is what the peoples of Earth, or our people that we are now genetically, spoke about Atlantis and what Atlantis truly was, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go into it first. Again, I have slide presentations. We got about 17 slides, so let's get right to it. So we have Echoes of Atlantis, Tales from the Lost City. And I call it echoes because these are past lives, right? So when it comes in, it sort of starts as an echo or a faded memory where little bits and pieces kind of come to you. But then after you pinpoint the portion of which you have to remember or you're trying to remember, it starts to become clearer and clearer when you clear the energies out of the everyday 9 to 5 routines that we also, happen to be a part of to maintain some sort of lifestyle here in this planet on this dimensional playing field right now. So, first, we're going to get to, like I said, the Greek version of Atlantis. And according to legend, the ancient gods and goddesses divided all the land in the world amongst each other. And Poseidon, the god of water, right, was given the island of Atlantis, which was actually the size of a continent. Atlantis was said to be larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, making it a respectable piece of land to inherit. Poseidon was pleased with his allotted land. He fell in love with the women who lived on this island, and one of those women was named Cleito. They were married and had 5 sets of twins. They were all sons, right? So think about how that works. We know that in genetics, when somebody has a set of twins, they are more likely to have more twins, right? But the anomaly of having twins each and every times, 5 times in a row, is astronomically, I checked, is almost astronomically impossible. So there's some sort of tampering with the genetical code within this woman to make her bear seed of the gods, right? So the oldest son to Poseidon was Atlas. And if we all know the story of Atlas, Atlas was the one who held the world on his back in later stories. And he was given rule over this island, which was also named for him Atlantis, Atlas, very close. In addition, he was also set to be king of this island. And he was also named king of the sea as well. And this is how the Atlantic Ocean received its name at the same time. Though he technically had control over the entire island, he chose to make the mountain where he was born and the surrounding land his home. So we would ask ourselves, well, if Atlas was a twin, what would happen to the twin that came with him, right? The other sibling. So Atlas's twin, Gerderus, right, was also given considerable inheritance. And it's said that he was given control over the area that was closer to the Pillars of Hercules that was part of Atlantis as well. The four other pairs of twins were also very known and very prosperous. They were all known to have impressive land and many subjects. Their names were Amphorus, Evmion, Minusus, Acton, Elapsus, Mestor, Azaeus, and Desperus, right? That's how's my Greek names, right? Calling out Greek names is kind of wild with the way that they sound. But we know about these people or these gods from tales. And actually these would be referred to as demigods because Cleito was a human woman. She was not of the lineage of those if and here's the other portion of what we want to talk about too, right? If we know that some of these gods, and that's big quotation fingers. Let me bring it back to me real quick so you can see the quotation fingers. The gods may have been of extraterrestrial descent. So now these might have been hybrid children. They're given access to a specific land, and this specific land is culturally rich, it is agriculturally rich, and it is rich with minerals and basically things that you would need to maintain a rule over the people that resided there. So let us keep going real quick because I want to get through this part really a little bit faster. In addition to ensuring his son's great wealth, Poseidon also built a great city for his love, Cleito. He carved the mountain where she lived into a great palace and placed three moats around it, each moat larger than the last. The moats were approximately 1 to 3 stadia, which we'll talk about what that means later. And they were separated by rings of land that were just as expansive, and bridges were constructed leading into the island. And also tunnels were carved into these moats to allow passages for boats in and out of the main city. Each moat was heavily guarded to ensure the protection of Cleito and her sons. The island itself was also rich with resource. No one had to toil in order to survive. All work was relatively easy and made for high quality of life. Every fruit grew in the soil, and the animals were plentiful enough for all those who lived there. The land was also rich in precious metals like gold and silver, and additionally, Poseidon himself had a stream of hot water and a stream of cold water that ran through the island to ensure that all needs of the people were taken care of, right? So we're seeing this picture kind of set out. They had hot springs, they had cold springs, they had everything. Now, if you remember from Galactical Histories or the Galactical Beginnings series, which is the next playlist below the most recent videos that we've done, you will know that there is a hierarchy to those three rings. The ones closest to God or closest to aka the ascended masters, as we know the true history of it, were the ones that resided within the center. That was the temple complex. And that was essentially a place where they would open and close portals. They would talk to the ancestors. They would also go and communicate with the ascended masters. And only specific priests that were of extraterrestrial descent resided within that centerpiece. After that would be the lower human priests that were trying to basically gain ascended masters certifications to be at that center pylon, I guess is the place what we would call it. And these people in the second ring out would play intermediary from the ascended masters who were of the pylon in the center to the regular people who resided on the outer ring of Atlantis. And that some of that information was confirmed through my time meditating and going back through my story. Now, when we hear about stories of people who essentially went through these past life regressions, a lot of them saw themselves as priestesses and priests, high ranking military, political officials. Some of those stories are amazing, and we have a little bit of that sprinkled into the stories we have tonight. But I tried to pick the more, I don't want to say mundane stories, but more of the stories that had consequence, right? More of the stories that sort of gave us contextual insight into possibly one of the three Atlantean cataclysms and the survivors of such, what would happen after, right? Some of these stories are very, very short, some of which are a little bit longer. So we'll go through it all really quickly as we can, right? Right. So the NPCs were on the outer ring. I wouldn't, at this time, I believe that there may have been minimal NPCage on this planet, right? Just to kind of go with my alias joke. It's a funny joke. I really did enjoy that really quickly. But so let's get back to it. So we're going to talk about what happens, right? Paradise Lost. What happens to this tremendous paradise land? There is something about everything being accommodated or basically put into perspective, right? What happens when there are no needs or wants of the people? Complacency happens. When complacency happens, 9 times out of 10, catastrophe follows. Complacency is never a place to get stuck in. And this is also a spiritual lesson as well as history repeating itself. So we can contextually look back at these points and look to now and say, you know what? It's there's a lot of similarity. There's a lot of similarity here. So what happens? It seemed as though the future of Atlantis was incredibly bright and prosperous. However, as the years went on, problems began to arise, and Atlantis, still culturally rich and immensely wealthy island, started and began this trend to be of greed. And greed began to arise in most of the people who lived among the upper echelon within Atlantis. This greed is often said to have come when the gods began to intermarry with the humans living on this island. Now, we're talking about this in the context of gods, but most of you can see the subtext of what's happening here. Think about replace God with extraterrestrial or extra entity, multi-dimensional being, right? There is this intermarrying and procreation of these hybrids. Now, is it safe to say that there may not have been all of a specific race of extraterrestrial beings within Atlantis, which we know it was populated by multiple races from the stars? So we're seeing their offspring start to have cultural problems or specific problems with each other, which is the way of the universe, right? One set of people doesn't like the way the other set of people does it, so they fight. But we're containing that macro into a micro, which is Atlantis itself. And then there is a sudden exposure of increased wealth and power bestowed upon the humans, and it made them more and more hungry to seek to conquer and to destroy other lands. And they started with the areas inside the Pillars of Hercules and sought to control that land, and especially around the Mediterranean area, because that's culturally rich and it's also rich in all different types of resources. So country after country began to fall to the power of the Atlanteans until one power stood against them. And that was ancient Athens, so talked about in these texts. Now, was it truly Athens that did it? We don't know. But you have to think that if it's of the Greek mythology, of course, their capital city is going to be the one to shut down Atlantis. But we know that Atlantis came a long time before the Greeks. So, who were the ancient Athenians that they are mentioning in this text, right? And it says, by some miracle, Athens was able to defeat the superior Atlanteans and conquer the Atlanteans. The Atlanteans were also forced to return to back to the Atlantis. And this is not the end of the story, right? So now, when the regular people from outside of Atlantis basically stood up to the Atlanteans, it says that Zeus had become angered by the actions of the Atlanteans and their attempt to conquer lands far beyond their own. Because of this, he sent a series of earthquakes so great that Atlantis sunk into the sea over the course of one day and one night. This is the Greek version of Atlantis. So we see that there is mention of cataclysm. This is one of the cataclysms that would be mentioned in some of these stories. Again, we're not going to talk about all three this evening. We're going to hit on two of them. And there's a reason we're going to hit on two of them. My story falls between the first and the second. And there are survivors from the first who basically go all the way up to the second. And lifetimes were a bit more extended back during Atlantean times. If we look in the Bible, we have record of this. People were living 900 years. Life was different. And that's because the extraterrestrial heritage that was in those people, the genetics of those people, were a lot different than we were today. And how some of those genetics have gotten basically genetically programmed out of us through reproduction and replication and things like that. But we're going to keep going. So this is one reference of Atlantis. Now, there's another reference of Atlantis from Greek culture that doesn't subscribe to the Greek pantheon of it all, right? And that is Plato and Atlantis. Now, this is super interesting to think about. These people were living among the same times, the Greek people, but Plato had a bit of a different idea because what his information came was from the Egyptians. So if you know about Plato's journey, Plato basically meets a Egyptian priest called Solon, and Solon gives him the information of Atlantis. We're going to talk about it a little bit more descriptive, but there is a lot that goes along the different Armageddons that plagued Atlantis, right? And there's a lot more to the story than just greed. There's extra entities at work that facilitated the destruction of Atlantis because it was a shining beacon of coexistence. And the people who, just like we see now, right? And this is the kind of the comparative tales that we're talking about. Right now in our society, coexistence is one of the most difficult things to achieve. Even though we're of the same peoples, we're of the same genetics from down to the root, but coexistence is difficult because of program. We're going to see that these programs play out, right? So let's keep going because I have a lot to get through before we get here. So Plato is well known for his many philosophical works, such as the Republic. But curiously, enough of the story of Atlantis was not meant to be one of his most prominent works. This tale is embedded in the Critias and Timaeus. The other than these two pieces, there's no reference to Atlantis that can be found within his writings. Interestingly enough, however, there is at least one work that is known to have referenced Atlantis before Plato recorded the story of Critias, right? And Plato supposedly quotes Solon, again, the Egyptian priest Solon, who he said had traveled to Egypt between 590 BC and 580 BC. And while there, he supposedly came across the Egyptian records of Atlantis and translated them. It was through these records that he discovered the story of Atlantis. This story was supposedly passed on from Solon and eventually to Critias. And they all became aware of this legend now. And it is that this Critias character who narrates the story of Atlantis in Plato's dialogues. So Critias explains that 9,000 years before the story he recites was told, Atlantis went to war with surrounding countries in order to expand their territory and show their might and superiority. alliances were made. But one by one, every power fell until there was only one left. And again, it points to the ancient Athenians. Coincidentally, the ancient Athens that is described in this story has a suspicious amount of similarity to the ideal society that was described by Plato in the Republic. And because of this, many people wonder if Plato may have fabricated the tale of Atlantis in order to use the story to demonstrate how his idea of a perfect society was correct. Now, we can tell you with the utmost certainty that while Plato may have described it this way, Atlantis was a real place. There is reference to Atlantis residing within the fifth dimension. Now, that is that is a great, great, great comment, and I'm going to put that up. This is why the remains of Atlantis were never ever found, right? But we're going to talk about that in a different way. Maybe not. We might not even get to it in this specific portion of this. We may have to get to it in the next one. But there is a dimensional difference between what the Atlantis that is referenced in Greek mythology and the Atlantis that is essentially the shining beacon city, right? Not there aren't two separate Atlantises. There is one Atlantis, but Atlantis basically resided on four or five dimensional playing fields. Well, it went from the essentially the third dimension or the third density dimension to the eighth density dimension with the ability of the people who were there, right? And w- I can't say that the Atlanteans don't exist anymore. I believe that to be false. I think that there are genetics that lead to the Atlanteans, and I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to show you a point of reference where we're going to essentially track where the Atlanteans went to. And that's where we're trying to get to in this moment. So the next portion that we're going to talk about is the sea people. Now, I was on Facebook the other day and somebody commented, "Do I know about the sea people?" Now, I do, and we're not going to get into tremendous detail right now, but these sea people are essentially a representative of what was happening in Europe around this time. So let's keep going. So the sea people, because of the warring nature of the Atlanteans that is described before the downfall of their civilization, there are many hypotheses that connect them to the sea people. While the official identity of the sea people remains a mystery, it seems clear that they were known to have posed as a great threat in the Mediterranean civilizations, similar to how the Atlanteans were thought to have caused problems, right? The ancient records seem to indicate that the sea people attempted to invade Anatolia, Syria, Phoenicia, Canaan, Cyprus, and Egypt at the end of the Bronze Age. And though the sea people have been recorded threat in many different civilizations, they have not officially been connected to any culture or race, making it difficult to claim that they were indeed originating from Atlantis. So we see this happening, right? And these people are represented a lot like the Atlanteans were, but there isn't a link that we can basically say that's it. That's where we have to look. So what happens next, right? So we're seeing I'm not sure that the sea peoples are the Philistines either, right? We know that the sea people could have been of Irish descent as well. The sea people, well, the Irish were known for taking their spiritual gifts all the way down to Phoenicia, Egypt, and everywhere else. So there's a lot of speculation on who these sea people were, and also the time periods that we look at to see exactly who the sea people are can change, right? The cultures can change via time. So when we're talking about Atlantis in the contextual sense, we're talking about something that was 9,000 years before Athens and Greece. So for them to see the sea people and speak about the sea people, it may not have been the Atlanteans, it may not have been the Irish, may not even been the Phoenicians, it might have been the Philistines by that time. But there's, you see what I'm saying? When we look in time and there's a concept of time involved, this sea people can change, right? But again, a lot of titles were given to people that don't supposedly were granted those titles, right? We could talk about the Greeks and the Athenians, and they thought that they were the epitome of culture at that time, and they gave themselves names as such. So it's all about whitewashing of history. So all of what we're talking about is speculation, 110%. But let's get back to the Mayan connection to Atlantis, and this is after the Cataclysm, right? So when the Europeans first encountered the Americas, they were instantly fascinated by the indigenous tribes, and we know this, especially the Mayans and their runes. They are, however, some theories of the Atlantis that Atlantis had arisen from the observations of the Mayan runes and the geography of South America. Right, one of the first theories that the land inhabited by the Mayans could be linked to the lost civilization of Atlantis likely came from the Abraham Ortilis, who's a cartographer and a geographer. And Ortilis is the first person to have conceived the idea that that continents were once joined together before they were broken apart, leading to them drifting to their current positions, right? And this theory led him to create another theory concerning the land of Atlantis that he wrote about in 1596 edition of the Thesaurus Geographus, stating, unless it be a fable, the island of Gadir or Gadis will be the remaining parts of the island of Atlantis or America, which was not sunk so much as torn away from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and floods. So continental drifting and shifting could possibly play a role in this. This is likely one of the biggest influences in Mayanism that led to people connecting the Mayans to the ancient civilization of Atlantis. However, there are many issues with that train of thought as well. We're not going to get into all of them. I think now we're about halfway through this, so we're going to get into some of the stories of Atlantis, right? So this is the tales from Atlantis portion of what we're talking about. So each one of these sections were described during different types of hypnosis sessions, meditations, and past life regressions, right? So during these meditations, people have received visions of their past lives in Atlantis before and after the great destructions. So this is talking about one specific person right now, and this is a woman. And we're going to talk about her story. So the first portion of her story, she talks about crystal lasers and what that means. And when she was 33, she did a series of meditations. And while she was not looking for past life memories, this is exactly what she found. She found deep memories within of her time in Atlantis and how Atlantis fell. She remembered her parents, whom I don't think she has ever met in this lifetime, the Atlantean parents, and detailed culture, right? She remembered her husband and her children. She remembered being a healer, and Atlantis was destroyed to building of a crystal laser without calculating the strength of what it could do. And she remembers getting out on a boat 2 days before Atlantis fell. And these memories for her were some of the hardest to digest. And it was difficult for her to accept what she was seeing and feeling in these meditations. So now there, she chooses the healer role, which a lot of people often do. But to remind her of the ego and the arrogance of Atlantis and how it was, she essentially was looking at it from a third person point of view. And she was out on the boat and seeing what was happening almost from the outside, right? She talks about how she survived the destruction as well. And this is fascinating. And there was a worldwide cataclysm of flood and fire that that she managed to live through, right? At the time, she was a male and she had a wife and two children, and she died during this disaster. And she remembered many details of the struggles, and essentially, she stayed alive throughout the actual destruction part, but died in the aftermaths. And she found herself in an escape boat, and she was being led by a warrior woman named Freya. And she reached the shores of a friendly land, which they named Freya's Land. And this and other related recalls were initiated by a Kundalini experience that dramatically changed her life. And she was also working with other Reiki masters to essentially find more portions of this story within her within her Rolodex, right? We talk about the Rolodex. So let us keep going. So the destructive use of power. When she was working with some of these Reiki teachers, there were issues of power, and she had an experience with an abuse of power. And suddenly she became aware of having been in Atlantis again, and a very powerful woman at a second turning, right? She's had multiple lives to Atlantis, this person. So she's also basically how they wiped out the population yet again. And she experienced such grief and remorse that she had used such destructive power in such destructive ways. And it was instrumental in making thousands of Atlanteans to populate other countries as well, primarily Egypt. See, this her story is a bit scattered because it comes in that way. And we can talk about a lot of, you know, the different aspects of what this means. So, we're going to talk about somebody who was an Atlantean priestess. And this is, like I said, comes up a lot. A lot of people were like, I was a priest, I was a priestess. I was a high roller in this, you know, in these civilizations. So she states, I was a priestess in the temple of Heragira on the southern coast of the island of Atlantis in the year 23,000 BC. I was pale skinned with strawberry blonde hair. I was very pretty and very happy with this content in this point of content in my life. I lived with my parents near a fishing village. I joined the temple in my late 20s where I studied metaphysics, channeling, and prophecy. I lived in the temple all my life, never marrying, but devoted my life to this temple and its teachings. I died in a very happy and contented fashion, knowing my spirit was to join other priestesses in spirit who were the guardians of the temple. So there's one person's account of living in Atlantis. Second is an Atlantean scribe. Now, this one is a little bit, a little bit different, but it says, I was a scribe and mystical writer named Miaka, pronounced Mika in English, for the high priest of Atlantis. I do not remember how old I was, only that I was young. I was male, and I wore a toga like robe of white, which symbolized power and purity. I had long hair, which symbolized the same. I had a wife and child, and in this dream or dream state, I remember being in a house made of stone and looking out onto roads of water, similar to Venice, and seeing a large wave of water rushing towards the city. I remember going outdoors along the fenced bridges along the sides of my house where my family stood. I remember facts like the shapes of the city, the high officials, the language, and I remember knowing that I had a family living in Egypt. This was my first life. I have others. And that was the Atlantean scribe. Now we're going to talk about home sweet home. So in Atlantis, I was at a place where I really felt I was at home. I had friends and people I could trust in me and support me in anything in life. The life in Atlantis was based on spiritual respect and unconditional love. People lived in accordance with the law of one and in brotherhood and sisterhood of Atlantis. They all had respect, honor, and loyalty to one another. In this life, I see myself as a healer and teacher. I had many additional gifts within my DNA. I had my own temple home where I lived. It was made out of white marble and light blue granite. The front of the temple had support columns that were very tall. The temples looked a lot like ancient Greek and Egyptian style in construction, but were more creative in science and color. Each column had descriptions of the Atlantean language, which was complex, and a lot of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs basically are very similar. The Atlantean hieroglyphs were a little bit more cryptic. They basically had three forms of writing language. One was similar to Phoenician, the other runic, and the third was a lot like ancient Sumerian. The hieroglyphic language they possessed was a lot like the Egyptians as well, but with subtle differences. They had mermaids, dolphins, fish, exotic birds, sisseed palms, coconut trees, tropical palms, and Norfolk Island pines and sequoia pines. Olive trees were plentiful, and they were very popular back then, as not so much today, but very similar, different from Egypt, but similar with their environment. When a person was seriously injured, or if they lost their vision, or if they lost a limb because of an accident, they would be taken to the temple and the most advanced healers would be called. They would place their hands on the affected area, giving life and balance to the place in their body that was damaged. Much like Jesus healed people in past times, the people of Atlantis lived in much the same ways as Jesus. This is this person's account of Atlantis. So, next, we have Atlantis was a heaven for humanities. Science also worked in conjunction with spiritual laws in their society. Their secret to be a better society was through God and to hear Him and gain the secrets of creation. We created a utopian world. We have a divinity gene with us in this. We are the we are the divine and we become part of heaven's touch on earthly life. Most of the people that lived in Atlantis were Pleiadians, but soon other star systems and other galaxies of humans came to Atlantis to learn. For Earth became the center of all knowledge in every corner of every star throughout space and time. That was one person's account, and I resonate with a lot more than some of the other ones. That one kind of struck me right between the eyes a little bit, right? So let's keep going. Now, here's where we have a similarity between that last story and this story. They talk about the seven sisters, and we know the seven sisters are of the Pleiades, right? And many ancient cultures revered these seven sisters, from the Aboriginals to the ancient Aztecs, the ancient Mayas, to the ancient Hebrews, to the ancient Irish. I mean, we could talk about every culture knew of the seven sisters. So this person is claiming to be essentially one of the seven sisters. By many dreams and collaborations with my past life sisters, I had come to discover that I was born in Atlantis. I was one of seven girls and were very important and strong magically. I remember later in that life, possibly the next life, that we moved to live in a very large white house on a lot of land. Our mother was killed along with one of the sisters in a ceremony, and we hid away with our father. Before our mother died, the babies slept in a solid white room with jasmine flowers on a table. The smell of gardenias and jasmine always makes me feel something very strong when I smell it. I peered into the aspect of myself that is linked into the Atlantis as a connection and soul partner of Tehuti, and I had known him in the reality as Zoroaster. In other programs, he plays a role of Tahiti in Atlantis. They, this is where we start to get into fabled ground a little bit, where Thoth and Egypt and Zeus and Greece. And she's saying that Tahuti or Zoroaster is the comparative mythological entity as Thoth and Zeus. And he was the eternal trickster playing many roles at the same time. He loves the magic, using rods in all of his roles to manipulate the electromagnetic energies of our 3D grid system. And you will note that most gods and goddesses, even Moses and Jesus, had rods or staffs that did more than the norm. So basically, we're getting into a story here. And this is going to be Ellie's story. This is one of the stories that we can touch on who this is from, right? And Ellie's story has bullet points at one point. We're going to get into those bullet points because it's very, very much a part of what we're talking about, and a descriptive bullet point, right? As I take a sip of coffee, we're at 46 minutes, and don't worry, my story is still coming. I promise you. I will give you my story in its entirety tonight. I know I saved it, the hopefully the best for last, but we shall see. So it says, as I examined my experiences with Tahuti in the Atlantean program, by reading these grid frequencies, and of course everything is about frequency, I began to see games were played there. Tahuti was the ruler of Atlantis for thousands of years. I played several roles with Tahuti, including wife and consort. Among them were Hathor and Isis, who are in essence aspects of the creational feminine frequency, which is all a part of us all. Therefore, you could see yourself in those timelines as those entities. If you trace your timeline's frequencies through the grids, you will return to the same sources of male and female yin and yang energies. I saw the Atlanteans as very tall in appearance, perhaps 50 foot or more. We had full use of our brains, which shaped differently than it is today. Our genetics were entirely different, and it would have to be if we were to vibrate on a higher frequency and be able to perform such instinctual abilities as telepathy, telekinesis, and teleportation. We traveled interdimensionally in our spacecraft when in the third dimension, right? Just going to change this slide here because we have more pictures. These are from Ellie's website, these pictures. So she says, we wore breastplates and headpieces made of metal that is not part of our periodic table. This was used for communication with the creational source. Jewels in specific patterns and matching creational geometry adorned our headdresses, breastplates, and sandals. Our language was a series of high pitched sounds, and in this timeline is referred to as trill. She states now that I was a priestess, teacher, and healer. I taught the ways of creation. Throughout my lifetime as Ellie Crystal, people have seen me in my role as a priestess in a temple at the time of the fall of Atlantis. You see, there are a lot of stories that we've just touched on now that revert back to this sort of archetype of story, just like Ellie Crystal. So, are we all accessing this sacred feminine, which is giving us this projection of this reality through this priestess's eyes? Because this priestess has touched all of creation, right? That's just something to think about. Ponder on that because I have while reading this. The things I observed as I traveled the timelines to Atlantis, right? The descent of souls from higher frequency programs to the 3D Atlantis. The ability, again, to travel interdimensionally. A total awareness of creation with a link to source. Learning and healing through giant crystals. The ability to leave your physical body when its usefulness is over. The ability to rejuvenate the physical body. When the souls enter into the third dimension, a whole new Atlantis emerged. Third dimension is the place the souls came to play out emotional games. It is the duality. It is the poles or polar. It is the mag or magnetic, north and south, yin and yang. The aim is to restore the balance, yet the program is set up for failure. I have a few memories of the catastrophic events towards the end of the program cycle of time. The next game was to be the Egyptian game, which was already up and running, and the games were running together in this first place. The grid frequencies changed from the Atlantean program to the Egyptian program almost overnight. With the Atlantean grids destroyed in the third dimension, a new one filtered in the souls lost the new one that filtered in the souls lost their Atlantean memories, as they were no grids to gain access to them anymore. The new Egyptian program retained just enough grid information for the souls to tap into, and at the end of the cycle of time, when they would move on to the next. And we are a point of transition. And if you found your way to this page, which is she's talking about her webpage, there is much, much more that will essentially come out of your DNA. And I'm going to after this is all done, I'm going to put that um, website in the description of this video. Right? This is all about the planet, the universe, and grids. And we can see that we are the Atlanteans, you and I, and we're about to make the leap from one holographic reality to the next. And that's where it all ends. These are the stories that I found from Atlantis. Now, this last one was moving for me because during my time in meditation and trying to figure out my past life of Atlantis, I understood that Atlantis wasn't just a third density reality. It was also a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, and a seventh. Now, when we start to see these patterns being performed within this rejuvenation of our memories in that timeline, we see that people are accessing a common point. They're coming in through a common point, which is the fifth dimensional frequency. And when you're there, you get the download from that fifth dimensional entity, which in turn gives you basically a road to find yourself in the in the third density again. So I've touched on my story a little bit. Now, when I was in Atlantis, I saw the first cataclysm and survived it, and was dead right after the second cataclysm. Now, the cataclysms were many years apart, thousands of years, but we lived longer then. Things were different. In my first incarnation in Atlantis, I was a mechanic. I worked basically almost like a scientist, but not. I was sort of more of the engineer, putting together the vehicles in which flew around the planet. They were also essentially interdimensional capable vehicles, which means that I knew a little bit of the science behind it, right? So I lived there. I had children, I had a wife. I was also trained as a warrior as well. And this is coming into bear because at one point between the first and second cataclysm, when an opposing it was sort of the Lumerian Mu Confederacy together, they saw Atlanteans as being weak. And this is why they tried to essentially go after each other. There were two warring factions. And to me, the Lumerians were the Atlanteans who left. But they weren't though. They were genetically tied to each other, but they were not the same. There were two separate types of humans on the planet at that time. There were the Atlanteans, which had more of a reptilian DNA, and then there was the Lumerians, which had more of the Pleiadian DNA. Now there was intermingling between both, but I can say with great assuredness that the Lemurians and the Mu were closer because they were more spiritual. The Atlanteans were more technical. They used their machines, right? And that was their way to try and attain certain spiritual paths. And it didn't work out, as we can tell. Now, I don't think it was all about the greed the first time. The first time it was an accident. But after that, and after the first cataclysm, which was an explosion, it turned Atlantis on its head. There was people trying to recover from that. So the vacuums of power that were left by that cataclysm, again, saw the wrong people rising to prominence. And when they rose to prominence, they played nice for a very long time. And as I am now, I was one who collected information along with being this mechanic. I was a part of a team that was pivotal of bringing Atlantis back online after the first cataclysm. And after that, we decided to endeavor ourselves into a place of using science to essentially explore more than hurt. And the people in charge sort of didn't like that. And that was part of the second cataclysm. Now, people say the third and final cataclysm destroyed Atlantis, right? For a long time, I thought that Atlantis had maybe taken off and that caused the Great Ice Age. But it could still be a possibility. I just don't think it's not in the third density for us, right? So after the first cataclysm, again, we tried to bring everything back online. We did, we were successful. Wrong people got into power. And the second cataclysm of Atlantis was more of a cultural cataclysm where the ways that we had lived before that became obsolete. And the people who were in charge were essentially changing the paradigm. They wanted us to be more of a warring faction kind of place as opposed to one that pursued technology, science, and spirituality. And the ascended masters that had lived in the center pylon left. They would not want to be a part of that. So, going through my history and going through my timeline, I saw that I was working to bring Atlantis back to its original state before the first cataclysm. And in doing so, I was essentially cast out and I died. And that's kind of how I was pursued from that point. Now, the next life cycle that I know about was many, many years later. Atlantis was already gone by then. And I don't know exactly where I was in that intermediary. I haven't figured that out yet, but I've used my time to really explore it, right? And we're seeing this now. We're seeing this in the way that a lot of our culture that has been set up to this point is trying to be rewritten with an inversion of logic. And this is such the happening of back then. And you know, I remember there were great power stations, and these power stations not only gave people the ability to have technology within their home, it also provided protective cover. But when the cataclysm of the explosion happened, that protective cover was actually a downfall of it all. Because when that basically it was like a shield, like a photonic shielding, and it kept the blast in as opposed to letting it exit out, which did a lot more damage than it should have. It should have been an explosion, and a lot of bad things would have happened. But it condensed it into an area and then created a fireball, which literally just swept across the streets. And essentially, I was in a lab or basically a mechanics type shop that protected me from that stuff because it had its own shielding in case we were to have an explosion while working on these items. So that was the only way that I survived the first one, and a lot of people had perished from that, even my children at that time. So this is part of my story, and going into the second cataclysm was, like I said, was a cultural cataclysm. It wasn't done with explosions or the wiping out of things. It was the way of life changed so much so that the people like myself were now obsolete and cast out because, you know, we were of no use anymore. The power vacuum had eaten all that up, right? And we were basically sent to be killed. Some of us didn't die right away, but we all died eventually. And there was a large group of us. It was almost a third of the population at the time because they didn't like what was happening and people were standing up for themselves. But the powers that be were just too, they had their hands on too much technology and too much of the narrative to get us out of that state and it was just too much, and we were overpowered. And that's and this is another reason why right now, being somewhat of an archivist and a person who does a show and trying to find the epitomes of my own spiritual essence, I have no problem running through that mill again and being cast out in that way. That's because I've done it already. I know what it's all about. It doesn't phase me, but I will do it again if it's to help those who come next, right? So, this is a little bit of my story. We can go into one day I'm going to write it all down and I'm going to do a dedicated show to that, but that is the gist of it. Now, going into dramatic detail is a little bit more difficult because I still haven't figured out all the details on that timeline yet. But that is the essence of my story. And was I a remarkable man during the times of Atlantis? Probably not. I was probably more of the workhorse behind the scenes kind of guy. I wasn't very vocal. I was a little more timid, but I did a lot of important work. So, with all that being said, I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. This was a blast from the past, an exploration of the echoes of Atlantis, right? And it, it's actually fitting that we went through different kind of archetypes of what Atlantis was first. And that's kind of why I did that. Was really cool to see what the textbooks say and what we know is different, right? So, with that being said, my name is Rob Yox. This has been Full Spectrum Universe, and I thank you all for joining us tonight. And I hope everybody finds this with love and light and positivity, and you spread that love to those that are around you because the world really needs it right now. Be the beacons, right? And we are the ones that we've been waiting for, and the information is the activation. Share this out. Please leave a comment when this is finished because that helps the algorithm boost us out. And share, share, share. This is important to share out so other people can find their past lives and their timelines, and we can all figure this out together. So, thank you all. I love you all, and I'll see you all soon.